My name's Liam Gutroy. I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund in Australia. I want to start by acknowledging and paying my respect to the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and paying my respect to the elders past and present. If this is your first NIF event, and there are quite a few of you here who are coming to one of our events for the first time, I wanted to give you the very short version of what we are here at NIF. We're a community of people who gather regularly in order to make an impact in Israel, to promote freedom, tolerance, equality and pluralism, and to shape Israel based on its founding values, dedicated to it being a Jewish homeland and a democracy for all its citizens. Those are the things that are core to what we do. So just before I introduce very quickly Deb and Anshel, I want to reflect on, I think, the election results that happened just a few weeks ago, and that all of us, I think there was a little bit of hope going into it, but we got more of the same on election day. And at NIF, our message has been that this is the time for us to double down on our support for our Israeli partners. Our Israeli partners who aren't going anywhere, they're committed to living in Israel, they're committed to seeing out and helping Israel thrive. And it's our responsibility, I think, to step up to the plate and say, how can we be the committed partners they need in order to bring out the values of democracy and inclusion and tolerance in Israeli society? So that's very much the message that we're sharing with our community. And I think the number of people who are here tonight, I think despite the election results, or maybe hopefully because of it, because we're the ones who are needed in this conversation, this partnership between diaspora Jews and Israelis, we're the ones who are needed to be there with them and to make sure that we get the results in Israeli society that we want to see. So with that, I'll pass on to two people who will definitely be dissecting this even more. So as I said, Deb Whitmont will be known to many of you, not just from her years on Four Corners, but also from a number of events that she's done now with NIF. And also formerly, of course, she was a Middle East correspondent for the ABC, left, I think, just before Netanyahu won power the first time in the mid-90s. And so that's certainly a perspective that she'll be bringing. And Anshel Pfeffer, who is one of the leading journalists in Israel, a senior correspondent for Haaretz, and also Israel's correspondent at The Economist. And this book, if you haven't read it, it's available for purchase outside, is a remarkable book. It not only charts Bibi's life and his experience in politics, but also it tells the story through the narrative of Israeli history, right from, in fact, even before its founding. So with that, I think I will pass on to Deb and Anshel. Thank you.
Welcome to Bondi, Anshel.
Thank you for having me.
Congratulations on your book. You always like a good, substantial book, stands up on its own. It's a great read.
And then it can be like a doorstop or something.
Oh, very handy, yeah. Before we start talking about the book, I just thought, since we've got you here, there are hundreds of rockets being fired on Israel as we're sitting here ahead of Independence Day and the Eurovision Song Contest. What's going on? Give us a heads up on how you see this playing out.
Well, I assume a lot of people in the room being as concerned and as engaged as you all are about what's happening. They don't really need me to update when and how rockets have flown, but first of all, I think we should mention that a father and a grandfather in Ashkelon was killed by a rocket a few hours ago, Moshe Agadi, and a number of Palestinians were killed. Some of them were killed, some of them were militants killed in attacks on Hamas and Islamic Jihad outposts. There was a mother and a child who were killed, according to the IDF. It was actually the result of a Palestinian rocket misfiring and landing shortly after it was launched within Gaza. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing just one more of these rounds of escalations which have been happening since the summer of 2014, Operation Cast Lead, which was the last major offensive of Israel, major clash between Israel and the Palestinian organizations in Gaza. And this dynamic of rockets being launched because of various, sometimes the Palestinians claimed it was because Israel shot something, because sometimes suddenly lightning struck on a launch pad and all of a sudden rockets hit, in one of the recent cases just next to Tel Aviv. In another case, even north of Tel Aviv, and demolished a house in a village near Kfar Saba, and miraculously, if you believe in miracles or just by chance, the family there, some of them were lightly wounded, but nothing else happened beyond their home being destroyed. These are sort of messages being sent by Hamas and Islamic Jihad because they know that in a sense they have some kind of a power over the government, because Netanyahu does not want to go into another major offensive into Gaza. He has numerous reasons, which we can go into if you like, why Netanyahu is very risk averse, very not, despite his warmongering and very aggressive image, he does not like big military operations, and Hamas realize that. So occasionally when they want to gain something, in this case they want to increase the frequency of money transfers, of Qatari money going into Gaza, which is something that the Israeli government agrees to, but delays for other reasons. This is the way they flex their muscles. Now, as we all know, and this is why we're here tonight, this is the week of Independence Day, of Yom Ha'atzmaut, and this year, especially 2 days later, there is the Eurovision contest as well, which I understand Australia's also got a bit of a stake in. Sort of
Even though neither of us are in Europe, yeah.
Yeah, Israel and Australia are both honorary Europeans for the sake of the Eurovision contest. Another major event, not just an annual event in this case, that Israel doesn't want to have ruined by warfare in Gaza. We can almost predict with, I'd say, 90% certainty that this round will once again be over within a few hours, perhaps a day, with the casualties that are, we can hope that there'll be no more serious casualties on either side, and neither side are solving the issue here. Netanyahu has not solved. He's, with all fairness, he did not create the Gaza. The Gaza issue has been around for 51 years. You could say even further than that, since 1948, when Gaza became an enclave under Egypt, from 1967 under Israel, and from 2015 after Israel, sorry, not 2005, sorry, after Israel withdrew from Gaza under the PA and then under Hamas. But the deeper issue of what to do with this tiny coastal enclave of misery, and we don't have to go into all the long list of people who are to blame for that misery and for prolonging that misery. Nobody was really trying to bring about a long-term solution, certainly not Netanyahu. And he's willing for this sort of cyclical violence every couple of months. Some rockets going over from Gaza, Israel carrying out airstrikes. Now, these airstrikes are very, I think, very measured in the sense that Hamas know exactly when Israel's going to attack. They know to evacuate their personnel from all the offices, bases, outposts, anywhere where Israel may attack. And you hear the reports, Israel carried out 100, 200, 300 airstrikes, and the number of casualties which you would expect from that kind of barrage would be in the dozens, if not in the hundreds, and they're a handful.
So it's a horrible and predictable dance that is playing out
on the same side. Hamas know and PIJ know that they can shoot 100 rockets. Most of them will either hit open areas or will misfire or will be intercepted by Iron Dome. Both sides know that they can use a lot of firepower. There'll be a small number of casualties. There'll be a day or two of headlines. The world doesn't really care that much anymore. People here are obviously aware because people here are engaged with Israel, but it's not even in the, we're both in the news business. It's not even on the main headlines of CNN or BBC. If we're lucky, it'll be unlucky, it'll be at the end of some kind of a news bulletin. It's no longer a big issue. There's no longer thousands of journalists around Gaza or inside Gaza as there used to be in previous periods.
Which is actually something that we'll come to when we start to talk more about Netanyahu. Let's go to the book, and we'll come back to the present, I think, through towards the end of this discussion. You've written...
Sorry, I've got to flog a book.
Yeah, oh.
No, I was moving.
Anyone can't read that? So you've written a biography of Benjamin Netanyahu, but it's actually much more than that. It's really, as Liam was saying, it's a political history of Israel and how this party that he leads has come to dominate Israeli politics. Did you always intend it to be that way, or was there this moment where you sort of realised, I'm writing biography, but actually what I've got here is something else?
Well, Debbie, I mean, you also know what it's like to write books, and usually when we're doing journalism, we have our, if it's in broadcast, we've got a 2 or 3 minute slot, or if it's a print report, so you've got 400, 500, 1,000 words. You know more or less what you've got room for. and you know how to do it. Suddenly, you're writing a book, you've got like, you feel you have an endless expanse of pages to fill with so many facts. And that's not the case, because when you start marshalling your facts and you're doing your research and you're starting to write, and suddenly you make your plan, how many chapters and how many words each. Then you very quickly you get to the limit that your publisher set for you, because publishers already know in advance they want to charge a certain sum for the book. The book has to be X pages long.
Oh,
you
don't
can't
disillusion
exceed.
everyone like that.
No, it's fun writing a book, but suddenly you come up against that wall much sooner than you'd expect. And when I started, after I had already a contract to write the book with publishers in the UK and the US, I started to write it. The first thing I thought, well, I'm going to be the John Caro I'm going to be the Caro of Netanyahu. I'm going to write every single detail that could ever be. I'm going to interview anyone who's ever met.
That's a true journalist's instinct, isn't it?
And very quickly I understood I'm not going to be Caro. And even if I could be Caro, there's no publisher for that kind of a book. He's like he's a one-off. So I start scaling down. I think, okay, how am I going to scale down the book? And it's maybe a bit boring for non-writers here in the room, but there's a dilemma. How do you write a book? How do you package someone's life story, especially someone who's had so much going on in his life and done so much, whether we like or don't like what he's done in his life. He's had a very full life, and he's still active. Sometimes we think of Netanyahu as this young guy who came along. When you were in Israel, he was that young guy who had suddenly come along, but he's 69. He's no longer a spring chicken. He's still very active. He still looks more like he did when he first came Prime Minister. You take a picture of him today and a picture of him 30 years ago, doesn't look that different. I mean, he was already silver-haired in his early 40s.
But you must have been at a point somewhere where you're thinking, oh, actually, this is about more than Bibi. This is actually about a history of Israel that, in a way, hasn't been told before.
So when I was looking at Netanyahu's life, and I thought, hold on, he was born just a year after Israel. He was born in 1949, a year and a few months after Israel came into being. And I already knew from quite early stage that I would be focusing to some degree also on his father and his grandfather and their influences on his life. So his father was the second generation of Zionism, which was born in the 1920s, and who were very active in the years leading up to 48, to the establishment of the state. And his grandfather, who was less well known, was of the first generation of Zionism, of the people who had attended the first Zionist congresses in Europe and had been a part of the ideological groups which coalesced into political Zionism and then split into the various factions which have evolved in today's political party. I mean, the main political parties of Israel today were around way long before the state. They were already around in the beginning of the 20th century. So you have these three generations of the Netanyahu family, originally the Milikovsky family, then became the Netanyahu family. And it's a way of telling the story of Zionism. Now, there's so many books about Zionism and so many books about Israel. There's certainly, you can, in the specialist bookshops, you've got entire bookshelves of them. So how to make this book different? And suddenly I realized that not only is Netanyahu's life and the life of his family the story of Israel, but it's a story of Israel which has never been told before, in the fact that it's a story through the eyes of the right wing. Now, all of the histories of Israel are all told through the eyes of the founders who were the members of Mapai, today's Labour, what was then the mainstream Zionist socialist ascendancy, which more or less ruled Zionism from the 1920s until through the establishment of the state to 1977, when the first time the Labour Party lost Likud. But the right wing were always there. There always was a right wing, a nationalist, it was called at the time a revisionist element in the Zionist movement. Many periods they were ostracized and marginalized and had very little power, but they were there. They had some influence. They were all the time trying to get into the mainstream and find their way to power. It took them many years, but they were there, and their story has been told. It's been told in isolation from the rest of the story of Israel. And certainly today, with Netanyahu in power, very soon going to be overtaking David Ben-Gurion as the longest-serving Israeli prime minister, with Likud very soon having going to equal the time that Labour was in power. Not yet, but another year or two, Likud would have been at the same time Labour was in power. I think the time has come to tell the story of Israel through their eyes, not just of the years which they've been in power, but of the entire period, how they were preparing themselves for power. And there's a poem written by Jabotinsky, nowhere near as beautiful as the song of David Broza that the two sang just before. It's one of my favorites. But it begins with the words, "God, you chose us to rule." This is Jabotinsky writing in the 1920s. And it took them more than 50 years to fulfill that.
The leader of the tradition that Bibi is now.
Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, the founder of the party which is today Likud, then it was called the Revisionist. Begin later on was, Menachem Begin was Jabotinsky's heir, and he called the party Haaretz, which is obviously freedom. And then various other parties, including the Liberal Party of Israel then, which doesn't exist today, joined together with Haaretz and became Likud. Likud's name to this day, and they don't mention it anymore, but the official name of Likud is still Likud, which means consolidation, a national liberal party. Now the word liberal has been, but if you look at the party's official papers in the Interior Ministry has a registrar of political parties. That's still the official name. A national liberal party.
So that's the sort of difference with your book, isn't it? It's an acknowledgement that Bibi's Likud, it's not an aberration. It's not as though the old Labour stronghold on Israel is the rightful hold and they're going to necessarily come back. I mean, maybe they will, but there's been a big shift, and that's what is different about your history.
Well, the evolution of Israeli parties, I think it's a very natural evolution. For 29 years, from 48 to 77, there was no change in government. Now, it's not good for a democracy to have 3 decades of uninterrupted rule of any party. And Likud coming to power in 1977 was, I think, a very natural thing. And it didn't come to power as a result of a major shift to the right, because I don't think Israel was never a very left-wing country. You know, Mapai, Labour wasn't. They were socialists in the sense that they did believe that the best way to build a state was through having collectivized economy around the kibbutzim, around the workers' unions. Israel, you know, people laugh at the fact that Israel, to this day, its health and its education system is probably the most left-wing. If you believe in a national health service being something which comes from the idea of coming from the left, then Israel is very left-wing to this day. Netanyahu hasn't changed the way the health service is run or the way they educate. You know, everyone, 99% of Israelis go to public-funded schools, their children at least. So the framework of the founders, the socialist Zionist framework, still remains and hasn't changed to this day. For the first time in this election, we had a party challenging that and saying that we should break down the public education and give out vouchers, which is an idea which is very prevalent in right-wing in many countries around the world. It was the first time we had that idea in Israel, and that party did not even cross the threshold. They got 2.5%, something like that. So they're not even represent. There is no serious. Can you hear me? There's no serious right wing in Israel when it comes to social matters.
Because Bibi's not really that interested in
He's
those.
not interested in social matters. There's a right wing when it comes to geopolitics and to running diplomacy and relations with Arabs and so on. But in the same coin, when Ben-Gurion and his people were in power, they were not left-wing in the sense of how to run the army and so on. It was a left-wing government which launched the Six-Day War and began the occupation, and they didn't end the occupation when they were in power.
That's a very different paradigm, isn't it?
So the left-right paradigm is very strange, and it's very different from any other democracy. And the evolution from Labour to Likud was much more of a social thing. It was a group of different constituencies and communities which were represented by Likud, especially the Mizrahim, who did not feel that they were represented by Labour, and Labour did not. They took them for granted for many years, that they took their votes for granted. They took the fact that they would live in working class neighbourhoods and wouldn't complain and would basically be the what they call in Hebrew the chotvei tzim v'shovei mayim, the woodcutters and the water drawers of Israeli society. And Likud was the first party to give them a feeling, at least, and also in real terms representation, which was commensurate to their part in society. You could argue today Likud does it less well, but they still feel
these parts of Israeli society, the Likud represents them much better than Labour does. So the evolution was not to do with the right-left. It was to do with a new part of Israeli society coming to the fore.
But of course, it's not really a grassroots party, which is something that you raised. But let's just get on to what shaped Bibi's belief system, if you like, and you talk about that through his grandfather and father. I think you describe Bibi as the culmination of 3 generations of narcissists, which, and the first of those was his grandfather. You just tell us a little bit about his grandfather, and particularly that one story that Bibi likes to tell. That sort of encapsulates.
So the interesting thing about Bibi's grandfather is that unlike Bibi and Bibi's father, Ben-Zion, the grandfather, Natan Milikovsky, was religious. Now, Bibi's an ultra-secularist. It doesn't seem that way because he's got such a great alliance which works very well for him and for them with the ultra-Orthodox. But in his private life, he doesn't keep Shabbat, he doesn't keep kosher. He keeps whatever he needs to keep
considering
for appearances.
How much use he's made
and it
of
was his father who, long before Bibi was born, basically left religion and kept as his own religion just nationalism, Jewish nationalism, but a secular Jewish nationalism. However, what keeps those 3 generations together is they all saw Zionism as a sense of nationalism, and they all felt repelled by socialism. They were very anti any kind of workers' union. That's what also attracted them to the revisionist movement. Now, his grandfather, Bibi, tells this story in stump speeches. He's been telling it for 30 years about how his grandfather was at a train station back in Tsarist Russia before the revolution, before 1917, with his younger brother, and they were waiting for a train or something. The story slightly varies, but it's stayed pretty much the same for 30 years. And Bibi tells how a group of anti-Semitic Russian men suddenly pounced on them and started beating them, and his grandfather, who was the elder brother, said to his younger brother, "Run away and I'll try and keep them off." And they beat him into the mud, and he was left there wounded. And according to Netanyahu, the grandson, who never knew that grandfather, that grandfather had died 20 years before Bibi was born, he made a vow that if he would last the night and if he would survive, then he would move to Eretz Israel, to what was then Palestine, and he would never allow this humiliation. This is such a humiliation for a descendant of the Maccabees to be lying in the mud, wounded and bleeding, then he would never allow this to happen again. He would move back to the homeland and rebuild a strong and proud nation. And that's totally apocryphal. I tried to find any proof of that story ever happening, but it's a myth in the Netanyahu family, and it works wonderfully for Netanyahu in his speech, because he always ends his speech, and today I am here as the Prime Minister of Israel thanks to my grandfather's promise that night in the mud. And the image is an image of Israel which always has to be on guard, because one false step and you're back in the mud.
And once again, his father also promoted in a different way this idea that the Jewish people had to be tough, had to sort of fight what was being brought towards them.
Well, you said that there were 3 generations of narcissists. What's interesting? The first two generations. You quoted me. The first 2 generations were men of many words. So the grandfather, when he indeed moved to Palestine, he was sort of a teacher, an educator. He was hired by Keren HaYesod, which the main fundraising arm of the Zionist movement, to go to America and speak in Yiddish to communities which had emigrated from Russia, but not like him to Israel. They had emigrated to America, and to go and try and play on their conscience that they're making money while their brothers in Palestine are pioneering and fundraise. So he was a man of words. He gave speeches, but he didn't succeed in climbing the rungs of the Zionist politics, and died at a relatively young age, frustrated at the fact that he hadn't been promoted within the Zionist movement. The same thing happened to Bibi's father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu. Professor Ben-Zion Netanyahu was a writer, a journalist, and not much of an orator, but someone who wrote polemics for the revisionist movement in their newspapers. He ran the revisionist office in New York during the Second World War, up until the foundation of Israel. When he moved back to Israel a few months after the state had been founded, Tzila, Netanyahu's with Tzila, his wife, Netanyahu's mother, and his elder brother Yoni, who'd been born in New York, he tried to get into politics. Menachem Begin, who was the founder of Likud, wouldn't have anything to do with him. He saw it as a win back. It was a small party. It wasn't going to have. It was going to have a relatively limited number of Knesset members. He wasn't going to give a spot to this guy who all he knew what to do was to talk and to write.
Saw himself as an intellectual.
He saw himself as an intellectual, and Begin had been for the previous 5 or 6 years underground with his own circle of underground leaders, of the people who had run the Irgun's operations. That was his power base. So even within the revisionist movement, which was itself the outsider of Zionism, Netanyahu Senior, Bibi's father, couldn't get a spot on the list. He couldn't. He was a double outsider. He was an outsider both by being a revisionist, and he was an outsider by not being part of Menachem Begin's circle. And there was, to this day, actually, Bibi does not rate Begin very highly. He barely ever mentions him in his speeches. There's no picture of Begin in Bibi's office. And that's, if anybody who knows how Likud has been for so many years, Begin was the icon of Likud for so many years.
No picture in his office.
No picture in his office. And not even in today's Likud offices in the Knesset. They're only in Likud's party or headquarters in Tel Aviv, you can still find a picture of Menachem Begin. Occasionally, when there's an anniversary, he'll say something about Begin, but he doesn't really. He remembers the fact that his father wasn't a fan and wasn't accepted. So at that point, Bibi's father basically left politics and went full-time into academia. So the first two generations were, as I write, were men of words but not of actions. They never managed. Their timing was bad. Their political instincts were bad. The third generation, Netanyahu, Bibi, is a man of words, but he's also a man of impeccable political instinct.
Well, that's the sort of question in the book, isn't it, as to how he's managed that and how the outsiders have become the insiders. And I mean, to some extent, there's a bit of rewriting of history that's gone on. Particularly, one example is in relation to his brother. I mean, do you think Bibi has deliberately rewritten history to make himself more central and to change that narrative?
Well, any kind of military history is always very prone to being rewritten. The victors usually write history. In this case, his brother was killed in Entebbe, the most what really was objectively an incredibly successful operation. 4 planes with 100 and something soldiers landing in the middle of the night in the middle of Africa, thousands of miles away from Israel, and carrying out...
For those who might not have been born, there was a hostage situation.
Now, I'm sure everyone here is aware of the Entebbe operation, 1976. I mean, I was 3 years old, so I don't remember it when it was happening. But you even speak today to military experts, not Israelis, from around the world. They'll say the Entebbe raid was their classic special forces operation that everyone still to this day learns how to do. Now, like any other military operation, it wasn't perfect. There were mistakes were made, and probably the biggest mistake was made by Yoni Netanyahu, who has been since elevated to the hero of Entebbe because he died there, and because he was the commander not of the operation, which is another of the myths made by Netanyahu. He was the commander of one of the 4 or 5 different units which were involved in carrying out the operation on the ground. He wasn't in overall command. He'd only been involved about last 48 hours of the planning, and he'd made a mistake by opening fire too early, or basically squandering the element of surprise. Now, this is not to say that Yoni Netanyahu was not a hero. He ran he ran into a dark terminal, not knowing where the enemy was going to be, at the head of his men. That was a heroic thing to do. But the true story of Entebbe has since been remade, even to the extent that the family has tried to claim that the shot which hit Yoni in the back was fired by one of the German terrorists who were part of the hijackers. But it's almost certain, according to the official IDF debriefing, that the shot was fired by Ugandan soldiers from the control tower, which does sort of suggest that for the family's point of view, if he'd been killed by an African soldier, it would somehow have been a lesser way to die than having been killed by a German terrorist.
It didn't hurt Bibi, though, that his brother became the most famous soldier in the world, if you like. He certainly promoted it. Then we had him going to America. He became this incredible package of fluent English, preppy suits, dapper looking, very, very smart. We saw a lot of him in the Gulf War. I mean, to what extent do you think he became a product of that time in America, and how conscious was that invention?
Well, a lot of people a lot of Netanyahu's critics talk about him somehow using his brother's death as a political springboard, and there's no question that made him overnight a figure, because he was the stand-in for his brother. His brother was dead, and his brother became the face of the operation because all the other members of the various units in the operation their identity couldn't be disclosed at the time. They were all in special operations. So the one dead soldier, Colonel Netanyahu, they even renamed the operation. It was originally Operation Thunderbolt. It was renamed Operation Jonathan, named after Yoni's. But that wasn't done by the family. That was done by the IDF, wanting to make the whole PR. As we know, the IDF can be very good at PR. Yeah. And this was a PR-worthy operation. And since the face of the operation was Yoni, and there you had Bibi, who was his younger brother by 2 years, had been in the same unit, had been an officer in the same special forces unit that Yoni had been in. So there was this closeness between them. In other circumstances, it could have been Bibi on that operation. They'd actually been on a number of operations together, and the famous Sabina operation. Bibi had been wounded in 1972, the first time the IDF had overpowered terrorists on a hijacked plane. It was Bibi who was leading one of the teams there and actually been wounded, and Yoni had been on the tarmac, frustrated at not being allowed to join because they wouldn't allow two brothers to be in the same operation. So there was a juxtaposition of which both of them could have been in that place at the same time in Entebbe. So there was a sudden natural thing of Bibi being the stand-in, being the guy who, as you said, immediately went on lecture tours around the world, especially around the US, and talking about what had happened. And they set up a think tank to talk about it. It didn't really work very well, but it had a kind of successful conferences about the war against terror, long before the war against terror became a thing. But what I claim in the book, and I think that if you analyze Bibi's career, it stands up, that even if Yoni had nothing to do with Bibi's career, and he had been anonymous, nothing had happened to him in Entebbe, I think that Bibi Netanyahu came along at the right moment for him at Israeli politics. He came along at a point, and you were reporting from Israel during that period, when the Israeli society, what we call in Israel, underwent its Americanization. And for many years, Israel was a Spartan, Zionist, kibbutznik society. Everyone was wearing khaki, and there were two kinds of cheese in the shops. There was white and there was yellow, and there was no nice wine to drink, and there was much more of a Spartan. It was just
changing. You're right.
It was changing, and one of the first things that changed was television. Television had been around in the West since the 50s. Israel came late; it came at the end of the 60s, and it was one black and white government-controlled channel. When television became in color, that was when Netanyahu was appointed to his first job in the U.S. Now, the first people to see Bibi on television weren't Israelis; it was Americans, because his job was he was not a professional diplomat. He was appointed as the deputy ambassador in Washington by Moshe Arens, who was his patron, and also himself was not a professional, but he was already a political veteran. He had been appointed by Begin to be Israel's new ambassador to Washington, to the U.S., as the Likud's ambassador, the first time that a Likudnik had been appointed as ambassador. And Arens wanted someone, he didn't want a diplomat to be his number two, he wanted someone who would go on television and be an effective performer. And he remembered Netanyahu from the conference, which had been made in Yoni's memory. Arens knew the family, he had been close to Bibi's father many years before, and he said, you know what, I'm gonna tap that guy. Netanyahu at the time, Bibi was having a very frustrating time as a furniture salesman. His one and only non-governmental job before becoming prime minister, and he didn't really like the job. And his girlfriend was living in America, and he wanted to go and be with her as well. And Arens one day came to him and said, "Look, I want you to be my number two." And he was at the time 31. And he was being offered to be the number two guy in Israel's main embassy in Washington. Obviously, he said immediately yes. And he landed in America, and there's an incredible, there's a documentary out now called King Bibi. You may have heard of it. It's basically someone took thousands of hours of footage of Netanyahu, and there are many thousands of hours of footage, and tried to look at the key moments where you see the Netanyahu on television changing. And there's this picture, there's a scene where Bibi's coming out of the State Department. This is at the height of the 1982 Lebanon War. And he was being called, the Israeli diplomats were being called in to be reprimanded because the IDF were charging through Lebanon and the Americans were trying to work a ceasefire between Israel and the PLO. And Sharon, who was then defense minister, was tell the army, disregard whatever you hear from the Americans, just charge through. And the poor diplomats in Washington were being called in to be, and were shouted at by the American Secretary of State, the Undersecretary of State. And one day, Aarons wasn't in town. Bibi was called in for his first high-level diplomatic meeting, and you can imagine Netanyahu today, this imposing world leader, then a 31-year-old diplomat, and it was the number 2 guy at the State Department, Lawrence Eagleburger, was this old, big chap with bold and very big bushy sideburns, was like, shouted at him, "What are you guys doing in Lebanon?" Bibi had no idea what was happening there because Sharon wasn't updating the government, so the people in Washington didn't know what was happening. And then there's this scene because that was a big issue then, the Lebanon War, also on American television. It was one of the first live televised wars. When you think about it, in the development of television, Vietnam was a war that wasn't really live. But that was the first period when satellite and CNN were coming into the real first televised war was the Gulf War in '91.
I was just going to say, and that's of course where we did see Bibi.
But Bibi is like the ultimate television age politician, and he was caught coming out of the State Department. Everyone, all the American television crews knew that an Israeli diplomat was being reprimanded inside, and they were waiting for him outside. And he came outside. And the picture is incredible because we see Bibi always very well. Everything's prepared, every hair is in place. Now he's got less hair than he used to have, so it's more important keeping them in place. But then he still had a full head, and he comes out and he's sweaty, and his hair is all awry, and his tie is askew. And this is not Bibi Netanyahu that we knew. And he comes out, and the worst thing happens to him. It's not just that he's all rumpled. He hasn't got what to say. He hasn't prepared a soundbite.
Unimaginable.
And this is not the Bibi we know. And the guy knew how to talk. He was charismatic, but he hadn't yet learnt that you always have to be ready with a sound. That you have to be ready for a camera. And he saw that night on television. He saw himself, and he realized the mistakes he had made. And we all think Bibi's a natural, but there's no such thing as a natural on television. It's hard work. You have to learn the job.
That was a formative moment. Obviously.
That was a formative moment, and he took lessons.
Oh, really?
Where he had he had a coach who coached him, and every weekend with his wife, at the time it was his second wife, Fleur, not the current one, Sarah, they sat in their flat in Washington. They hired a video camera. Then it was a big deal in 1982 to hire a video camera, and they sat and trained, and they worked over and over and over, and they prepared how to do the sound bites, and he even learned how to apply his own makeup. He went around for many years with his own power pack in his pocket until he was already important enough to have his own to have someone doing it, and the result was immediately visible because he became a constant guest on American television. Then also America was beginning to confront terror for the first time. The attacks on the American embassy and the Marine base in Beirut made Americans suddenly realize for the first time that they're facing terror organizations. And then it was Libya and the attack on Gaddafi. All these things, Bibi was there at the right time because the American television needed a terror expert. And now you've got thousands of terror experts in waiting in every studio. There was no one then like him.
So we will have time for questions, and I will try and get to the present day, but as you can see, there's a lot to talk about. Did he see where all of this was going, do you think, or was it just dumb luck and good timing?
No, I don't think it was dumb luck. I think he grew up in a very political household. His father had left politics in '49 after being snubbed by Begin. But that was the main issue on the table. They talked about two things in the Netanyahu household, politics and history, and they were merged together. And it was very clear, you can read from the letters of the Netanyahu family and from the conversations that they were having as teenagers and as young men. And those are the people who knew Bibi, the people I've interviewed who knew Bibi at the time. it was very clear to Bibi that he was going to have, from the moment he was tapped as a diplomat, it was good. It was a stepping stone to politics. And he was already talking about how he's going to join Likud and how he believed he can sweep away what was then called the princes, the second generation of Likud leaders who were all of Begin's assistants and deputies. Bibi didn't see them as rivals. And the truth is, he came in '88, joined Likud, and he got the first spot on the candidate slate. So he was right. He knew that he could beat them at their own game because they couldn't appear on television. He knew that he was coming along at a new period for Israeli politics, when presentation suddenly meant so much more, because Israeli politics was never about presentation until Bibi came along. It was all about substance. It was about making rousing speeches in squares, but not about going on television. Anybody who remembers Begin or Shamir on television, they were total. They were not in their element either, and
they didn't
also
speak English, did they? Did Begin speak
English? Both of them spoke
No.
very accented English. But also on Israeli television, they weren't. It was a different period because also the interviewers treated them with deference. But suddenly, Netanyahu was there, and he was a swashbuckler. He could shout at the interviewers; they would shout back at him, and it would become interesting. All of a sudden,
But of course
it was a performance.
So what about content? And has Bibi himself changed? And what about his beliefs? I mean, is it all about him getting elected, which he's obviously very good at doing, or is there more to it?
Well, there is a tendency to see Netanyahu as just a great performer, but not to really have a bedrock of ideology. And anyone who's read Netanyahu's book, and Netanyahu wrote a book called Place Among the Nations, which was published in 1993. It's a 500-page book, and you could call it the ultimate Hasbara handbook. It's not really a handbook because it's 500 pages thick, but it's got everything there that is today the slogans and the ideas and the arguments of the Israeli right wing. The Israeli right wing, most right wingers haven't read Bibi's book, but they've sort of they've assumed the ideas by some kind of sorry.
They've absorbed
the ideas from people who have read it and from him, because he makes he takes the history of the Jewish people there and writes it from his perspective, from this nationalist, survivalist perspective, and then he develops the arguments of how Israel should be running its foreign policy and its presentation. He sees the presentation of Israeli policy as a core thing. And when we sometimes laugh about Hasbara, explaining Israeli PR about how sometimes
Can you explain what Hasbara is?
Well, Hasbara, as I'm sure many people here in the room know, it literally means to explain. But there's a frame of mind that if we explain ourselves well enough, then the world will suddenly be convinced that we can do whatever we want. Now, every country has PR. Every government has press operations. But I'm not aware of a democratic government which has such a feeling that if just the PR can be okay, then everything will be okay. And this is really a cornerstone of Netanyahu's belief that if he can just explain himself well enough, then everyone will agree with him. And if you don't agree with him, then you're an anti-Semite. That's the only reason possible that you can't agree with him, if you've listened and seriously taken his arguments. So there is an ideology there, and it's a very deep history-based ideology. It's a very bleak ideology because it sees Israeli and Jewish existence as something which has no choice but to live on the sword and to be never to make any concessions, not to see the Palestinian narrative as anything even worth considering, even as an opposing narrative, but totally cancelling that narrative as having any validity. Netanyahu begrudgingly says the word Palestinians, but in his book he explains the Palestinians are just a ragtag group of nomads who gathered in Palestine at the same time the Jews were coming back, because the Jews were developing the land, and therefore the nomads had an attraction to come, had interest to be there, because the place was being developed for the first time in the history of the region, the Middle East, for 2,000 years. So he sees the Palestinians as an artificial construct. He has to deal with them, but he sees them as something which can be put to the sideline, can be put on the back burner. And I've heard him say to foreign visitors, when they brought up the Palestinian issue, said, look, it's a rabbit hole. You want to go down that rabbit hole? Be my guest. But his policy is to make that as much of a sideshow as possible. The big issue is Iran. The big issue before that was Iraq, and before that the Soviet Union and radical Arab regimes. he'll always find a big issue which will put the Palestinian issue to the side, also because he believes in it. It's not just something which is convenient for him, but it also is very convenient.
It is convenient, yes. But in a sense, he's been proven right, because now that has almost become what has happened. The Palestinian issue has faded from the centre of world attention because the rest of the Middle East is in such a mess? Or is it because Bibi was right all along and it was never going to be that important?
Well, Bibi has always been very pragmatic with the situation he's dealing with. So when he had a newly elected US President, Barack Obama, who very clearly said at the beginning of his term, he said, "I'm pro-Israel. Being pro-Israel does not have to mean that you agree with Likud policy." That was basically Barack Obama's opening statement regarding the Middle East. So he knew he had to adapt. So he said, "I accept the two-state solution," though he made so many caveats in that famous Barryland speech as to make that meaningless. So he didn't really change his policies, he just changed his terminology. But it's true that he even then was trying to put the Palestinian issue on the back burner, but he made a sort of tactical concession by accepting a two-state solution. But when you look today, as you said, it's faded from the world agenda. The Palestinian issue is not even on the Arab agenda anymore. There's so many bigger things happening in the region.
Well, and Netanyahu's not under pressure about it, really.
Even when he was under pressure, he knew how to sort of like deal with it. But he was ready for this to happen. If you read his book 25 years ago, he predicted a period when the world would give up on the Palestinians, when the world would no longer see it as a big issue. And to be fair, some of the international community's concept that the Palestinian issue is the key to fixing the Middle East was wrong. And we see it today. The Palestinian issue had nothing to do with what was happening in Tunis, Egypt, Syria, between Sunnis and Shias.
At the time, it might have been right, but now things have changed.
I doubt if Rabin and Peres and Arafat, or if Barak and Arafat had managed to solve the issue, would that have prevented the Arab Spring or then the Arab revolutions, the breakdown of Syria, the breakdown of Libya? There were other dynamics at foot there.
I feel like we're on a speed history of the Middle East and Israel. I'm sorry to be sort of rushing over so many things, but I'm conscious that we want to get to some questions. When you write a big book like this, you're looking about change. You know, change. Bibi, the person, has he changed? Israel, has it changed? Do you think over the career of Bibi Netanyahu, Israel has changed, or how has he changed Israel?
I think Israel's evolved in ways which certainly in hindsight could have been expected. Israel's become more westernized. Israel, it was so much more Spartan and so much more an ideological society. It's become much more materialistic, I think, as we all have.
Has it become more racist?
I think that the racism was always there. I think it was, as racism exists in every society. If you look at what was happening in the 50s and 60s, the Israeli Arabs were treated worse than they were, certainly by the government. They were held under military law until 1966. An Arab citizen could not leave his or her village or town without a special chit from the military governor. So, that was under the Labour government, and certainly when it comes to budgets and to just the prominence of Arab individuals in more senior positions, today is better than it was 10 or 20 or 30, certainly 50, 60 years ago. So where the racism has become worse is it's become more overt. But that's also because we have better reporting today, and we have social media, so that all the hate is out there. And if
we're seeing that here.
So if if an Israeli politician or rabbi or even a private citizen says something hateful about Palestinians and he puts it on Twitter, then people in Australia know about it immediately, and you can just do Twitter Translate and you know about it the minute it happens, and everybody's on the lookout for it. I think what has got worse is not necessarily the level of racism, it's the way it's being used in politics, and the way Netanyahu, certainly the last two elections in 2015 and last month, has consciously tried to harness those racist feelings towards strengthening and consolidating his base in Likud and bringing out the vote. Because in 2015 we saw in a very clear way how on election day he came out with his Arabs are moving in droves to the polling stations Facebook video, and in subsequent hours, the turnout in Likud areas went up, and we saw the most fascinating thing is that when you have an exit poll, when the polling ends at 10 p.m. in Israel, they immediately have the exit polls. But the exit polls have been prepared 2 hours in advance. You can't tabulate all the answers in the
Straight
minute.
away, yeah.
So what you're getting is basically a snapshot of the situation until 7:30 p.m. At the best 2.5 hours before. But we know that the change, so we can see that the change came the last 2.5 hours of that election.
After he'd spoken.
The gap for Likud grew and grew. So, and we saw similar things happening last month in Israel. So, and then we also had this sort of dog whistle kind of racist campaign when suddenly it turned out that Likud had been putting hidden cameras in polling stations in Arab areas, and that was once again a way to broadcast.
That true?
They were proud of it. They even said, "We're fighting against fraud." And yes, there is fraud. There is election fraud in some areas of Israel, including also in Arab areas. So there was a certain patina of legitimacy to what they were doing, but it was very clearly a dog whistle to the base. Look, if the Arabs are going to try and steal the election, you've got to come out and vote for us.
Which brings us, briefly, if we can be a bit brief about this perhaps, but to Trump. And I suppose, and it's clear from your book, that Netanyahu must have thought all his Christmases had come at once. That's a bit inappropriate, isn't it? When he saw Trump in the White House. But to what extent are they kindred spirits? Is Bibi almost the forerunner of Trump?
Well, first of all, he wasn't totally certain he wanted Trump to win.
Really?
Because Trump is unpredictable, and Netanyahu is a status quo, risk-averse person, and he was worried about Trump initially, but like you said, very quickly he realized his Christmas, all his Christmases, all his Hanukkahs, and all his Pesachs go one go.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting question: are they kindred? First of all, they're very different in a couple of key ways. Bibi is an intellectual, and sometimes I speak towards to liberal audiences like him. People don't like hearing it because the idea of intellectual is something positive. But you can be a right-wing intellectual as well, and he is the quintessential right-wing intellectual. He reads most of his day, if he hasn't got meetings, and he delegates a lot of his meetings to his underlings, he sits in his office and reads. He reads biographies, he reads history, he reads books on macroeconomics. I've never met a politician who is deeply read and from childhood. When he was a kid at 7 or 8, his father would sit down and do his homework with him, only in history. It was the only thing his father did homework with. And he would make them write essays at the age of 9 or 10 about Maccabean history and ancient civilizations. That's the kind of person Bibi is. Donald Trump hasn't read a book in his life. It's not.
Well, you can be fairly confident that that's the case.
Yeah. He's written the book. Well, he's written for him, but that's it.
Yeah.
And the other thing which they're different is, and it's connected, is that Bibi does have a very deep understanding of geopolitics. You could sit right now with Netanyahu, and if he was here in the States, he would explain to you the power politics in the Far East between China and Japan and India, and why Japan has fallen behind, and why India is now rivaling China. He could spend a half an hour now explaining it, and it would be spellbinding. He understands how the world works at those levels. This is also why world leaders respect him, because they find him someone they can talk about this kind of stuff. He knows the business. So in those two things, he's the opposite of Donald Trump. There is one way in which they are very much kindred spirits. It's in the way that they connect with their base, and it's not a matter just of having good advisors and good polling, and their campaigns are well organized. Because the Trump campaign in 2016 was terribly organized, but they both have an instinctive feeling for fear. They understand the fear. They don't even understand them. They get the fears of their base on almost a metaphysical level. And they're both elitists. I mean, Trump is the son of a millionaire. They call him the blue-collar millionaire, but he's a millionaire. He was born a millionaire. And Bibi wasn't rich when he was young, but his father was a university professor. He was certainly a member of the intellectual elite. But both these leaders, their voters come from the working classes. Their voters are blue-collar. and they understand the fears and the resentments and the phobia and that the outsideness of their voters, and they can stoke those feelings, and they can latch on and use those feelings to bring out the vote. And both Trump brought out voters who
and it works.
It works. It's a winning. Israeli politics is very different than American politics, because American politics are presidential. You're running against two candidates running against each other, whereas in Israel it's a prime ministerial parliamentary system where low threshold, so lots of small parties get in. You need to be a coalition builder. Now Bibi is a coalition builder, but
par excellence.
it does not mean. But usually when you say coalition builder, you think of someone who brings people together and ruffles and smooths their brow and bridges over the differences. Bibi is a coalition builder of a different kind. He finds all the resentful people, all the people who feel outside, the ultra-Orthodox, the settlers, the Mizrahim, anybody who feels out and angry with the old establishment, and he keeps them feeling that way. Now, it's absurd because he's been in power for 10 years. Likud has been in power for 30 years. So how can Likudniks and how can right-wingers and how can settlers still feel disenfranchised? Bibi is the one who's keeping them feeling that way. He, by constantly railing against the media and against the courts and against academia and against the elites and the establishment, he's the establishment, but he's created the feeling that he's never the establishment. And to hold on to the little bit of power that we, the right wing, still have, you need to come out and vote for me, because if you don't, the elitists will be back in again, and they'll kick us.
It's the ultimate irony of the outsider becoming the insider. But it's one last question from me, and then we will open it up for questions. Now that he is having to, you said, he's the great builder of coalitions, and that's what he's having to do. He's doing that now under the gun, facing the possible indictments. How do you see that playing out? And is he going to be held hostage to the fact that he may end up himself indicted?
Well, his coalition partners are very much aware of the fact that not only is he now holding talks with them to form a coalition, which happens after every election, he's now also holding talks with them to keep him in power once he's indicted. So there are now two prices to go into the Netanyahu coalition. There's the regular price, which is to be part of a government, and there's the extras price to be also part of the post-indictment coalition. So now you've got Netanyahu is being held over two barrels now by his coalition partners. Now he's trying to get one deal. He's trying to get two deals for the price of one. So at some point in the coalition negotiations, one of his representatives is going to say, in addition to joining the government and agreeing to policies, we also want you to support some kind of an immunity law, or make some kind of commitment that you'll stay in the coalition, in government, even after the Prime Minister is indicted. And that's where he's being held hostage, and we don't yet know what the price is going to be, and every party is going to have its own specific price.
And is the talk of annexation part of that?
It's already real? One of the demands being made by the Union of Right-Wing Parties, which used to be Jewish Home, and now it's an amalgamation of various right-wing religious and also one Kahanist or racist supremacist party. They've already made that demand, and Netanyahu's already said that he's willing to consider legislation for a law which will not exactly annex, but will make the Israeli law in settlements. There'll be Israeli law, which is some kind of a legal technicality, and he's also bargaining. He doesn't want to give everything away. He made a sort of vague promise on the eve of election to annex, but he hasn't done it yet. He hasn't done it for 10 years. He's waiting to sell that off at the right moment, when he needs it the most, which will be when he's indicted. So we're going to see over the next few months very intense bargaining between Netanyahu and his far-right allies over that specific issue. What are you going to give me for annexation? And it's going to be obviously immunity, and he may or may not have enough Knesset members to hold on. And this is going to be the crunch in the next few months, because he's going to have a hearing probably in July, perhaps in September. After that, the Attorney General will make his final decision, And then we're going to have an unprecedented situation, assuming that Netanyahu's lawyers fail to convince the Attorney General to drop the charges. And that's a pretty safe thing we can assume is going to happen. Then we're going to have for the first time a Prime Minister in office under indictment. It sounds unthinkable that a Prime Minister will be dragged to court every couple of days and sit in the dock while running the country. But this is Netanyahu, and he's already done so many incredible things, unthinkable things, so I wouldn't rule it out from happening.
I promised this wouldn't get depressing. I don't know how I could have thought that it wouldn't.
There's music afterwards.
There's music, thank goodness, afterwards. I mean, just on that, and we've talked in these forums before about the erosion of the rule of law and the role of the Supreme Court in Israel. I mean, is that going to be Bibi's legacy, that the law and justice in Israel is going to be so severely damaged?
Well, I think one thing we have to remember, and you can find some optimism in that, is that Israel is the only country that I know of in the world that has put a prime minister and a president in prison without a coup, just through due process. I mean, even the United States could not put Nixon in prison. He was pardoned. But in Israel, Ehud Olmert, Netanyahu's predecessor, and Moshe Katsav, a previous president, both went to prison on criminal charges. And the Wing 10 in Masyal prison, which is not far from Tel Aviv, Wing 10 was renovated for Ehud Olmert because the prisoner has to be equal to other prisoners. He has to do all the other things that prisoners have to be counted 5 times a day and all the other things, all the other degradations of prison life. And at the same time, a former prime minister has to be secured in a certain way, which will make sure that all the secrets he has in his head, even though he's no longer prime minister, are kept safe. So there was an entire wing renovated for Ehud Olmert's incarceration. That wing is still there. So if you want something optimistic, Wing 10 in Masyar prison is waiting for Netanyahu.
Okay.
Whether or not he'll enter the gates,
we'll take that.
In the next edition of my book.
Okay, well, we'll take that as in the scene of desperation. I think there's a microphone around. Now, there is, it's really hard to see because of the lights, but we can have questions, and you know what a question is? It's got a question mark at the end. You know, I'm actually quite brutal about this sort of thing, so I will cut you off if you're starting to make a big, long statement. Have we got a mic? And has anyone got a question? There's a question here.
Martin Gilbert, in his book called Israel, says the greatest tragedy of modern Jewish history is when Rabin was assassinated and Shimon Peres became the prime minister, but didn't go to election straight away. He tried to negotiate with Syria and what have you, and consequently he lost the election. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't know if it's the greatest tragedy, but it certainly was a big mistake on Shimon Peres' part. And Shimon Peres made a lot of decisions and, in hindsight, mistakes when it comes to Netanyahu. Shimon Peres, for example, was the guy who decided Netanyahu should be the ambassador to the UN in 1984. And one of Peres' many mistakes during that election, which began at the end, basically was kicked off by Rabin's assassination, was, like you say, not going immediately to election. But he also rehabilitated Netanyahu. He called Netanyahu in a week after the assassination and gave him a formal update as the leader of opposition. And many of his colleagues were very angry because they saw Netanyahu as someone who had at least in some way been accomplice to the murder. Now, that's not fair because Netanyahu had nothing to do with the murder. But there was an advantage at the time, both because of sympathy towards Peres as Rabin's successor and anger towards Netanyahu, who was seen by many as an accomplice. If Peres had gone to immediate election, it's hard to see Netanyahu having any chance. And also, he won at the end by a sliver. So any advantage that Peres gave him was certainly a tactical mistake. And your quote from Martin Gilbert is accurate. That was a big mistake by Peres. The biggest tragedy in Israel's history is... a bit sweeping, I think.
For that. Yeah, but, and then of course there was I was there at that time, and there was a terrible round of terrorist attacks and deaths and explosions. And as that tide turned, it became more and more difficult for Perez, obviously.
And in the end, still, Netanyahu only won by 0.5%. So
Oh, you talk about the exit polls. They were all saying it was a Perez victory.
Yeah,
yeah.
it was.
Another question? Sorry, this lady here?
But just, I mean, there could have been, there's an entire book, and books have been written about that campaign, and that was just one of many mistakes that Perez has made. And Bibi played the blinder. You know, he knows how to run campaigns. He came from 25% down and won.
Yes.
Hi. As a Jewish person, I feel an automatic affiliation with Israel. But as a South African, I'm also embarrassed about apartheid South Africa. So when it is sometimes said by people that Israel and South Africa are analogous in terms of apartheid, I become immediately defensive and also conflicted. And I'm wondering if you think that there are analogies and where the similarities and differences might lie.
I mean, whenever I'm confronted with that, the first thing I say is that I think it's disrespectful towards victims of apartheid to make those comparisons, because it's a lazy and it's a shallow comparison. I think that we shouldn't be making those sweeping comparisons, because there's enough bad things happening and enough good things happening to make every case, certainly when we're talking about an entire society and an entire history of a country in that context. I'm ashamed in Israeli of a lot of racist things happening in Israeli society. You know what? I'm also British. I'm ashamed of a lot of things happening in Britain now as well. Nobody's calling Britain apartheid as well. It's really just a very lazy and shallow comparison, and it's very rarely made out of good intentions. So I don't feel that. I mean, obviously I can't relate to what you feel as someone who's a South African, so it's difficult for me to go into deeper details. But there are many things that need fixing in Israel. The occupation is a terrible thing. It has to end. As Deb mentioned, there's no pressure now on Israel to end the occupation. And I think part of the reason why people are bringing up the apartheid comparison when it's being made in good faith, and there are a few, is that there is a feeling, and I'm not an expert on South Africa, but there's a feeling in certain parts of the West that apartheid ended because of pressure from the outside, because of boycotts. And I know that's very inaccurate. There are lots of reasons why apartheid ended. But I think people want to call Israel apartheid in some cases because they think, oh, well, we will boycott Israel and Israel will end the occupation. We know that BDS is a failure as a tactic and as a movement. So I think people are using the analogy today to try and keep some kind of hope alive that if we pressure Israel enough, things will change. You know, Netanyahu had 8 years of Barack Obama, the most liberal American president ever, and he didn't change anything. So it's changeable, and I think people here in this room will agree, change has to come from within. And I hope that some of the things that New Israel Fund does will help that. I know that it's helping. I hope it will help even more. And with your support, and that these things will change within. It's not going to happen because of some kind of South Africa anti-apartheid style boycott.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I'm
Thanks a lot. Actually, Gideon Levy of your newspaper has used the apartheid analogy a number of times. That's not my question, though. You may recall that yesterday at the Sydney Writers' Festival...
I'm hearing this from here, so whoever's talking... thank you.
You may recall that you were at the Sydney Writers' Festival yesterday.
I have a dim recollection, yeah.
And I was there. And you mentioned about the rise of right-wing leaders and right-wing movements at the moment, Brazil, America, Austria, Hungary. I'm not sure how that's relevant to Israel, but to what do you attribute the total decimation and disintegration of the Labour Party in Israel over the last 20 years?
Well, I think it's relevant because while apartheid and Israel, I don't think are good comparisons, there are certain political and ideological currents going around the world which you can argue. And Deb asked the question before: is Netanyahu in some ways a harbinger of nationalism? And by the way that people like Viktor Orban and Donald Trump and Matteo Salvini from Italy and many other nationalist leaders come to Israel, and talk of Netanyahu as being their inspiration. I think that he is, in some ways at least, and there are distinctions also to be made, sort of almost a father figure for that nationalism. But the question that you said about the recent election in Labour, I think that Labour has been struggling for years now to work out what it stands for. It's very easy to work out what Labour stood for in '48. It was a party founding a state. I mean, in Britain, Labour talks about itself as being the party which founded the NHS, the health service. In Israel, Labour founded an entire state, and it's an incredible achievement for any political party. It founded a state. It built the economy. It built the IDF. It built Israeli society for 30 years. I don't think there's a political party with that kind of success anywhere in the world. But then in 1967, it lost power. And it turned out that Israel can actually exist without Labour running the things. Perhaps not as well. We could argue about the Likud record. I don't think the Likud has had a stellar record. But now we're already 42 years since Labour lost power for the first time. They've regained... we've had Labour governments and Labour national unity governments in the period since, but they've always been short-lived. Last month was the first Israeli election ever where 18-year-olds going to vote for the first time had never had a Labour prime minister in their lifetimes. That's a massive precedent for Israel. And the reason is that Labour hasn't found a way to re-articulate what it stands for. So for 30, 40, 50 years, even they said, Likud is an aberration. We're the only party who can run the country. Turns out that there are other parties who can run the country. Then they became the party of Oslo. We're the party who, having founded the state and having ensured its prosperity and security, we are now going to be the party leading the historic compromise with the Palestinian people and will be solving this issue. But this issue wasn't solved. Oslo failed. I'm not going to go into now who's to blame. Both sides are to blame. But Oslo failed, disengagement from Gaza failed, and on a deeper level, Labour's argument and the whole Israeli left argument and the international community's argument has always been Israel needs to end the occupation and solve the conflict with the Palestinians, because without this, Israel will not be a prosperous country. Without this, Israelis won't have a comfortable standard of living. Without this, Israel will generally be isolated, treated as a pariah, treated like South Africa in the 80s and 90s. And as Ehud Barak famously said, there'll be a diplomatic tsunami against Israel. Or Sharon said, when he had explained why he was leaving Gaza, if we don't do this, we'll be like the bull taking the corrales. You know, the corrales is where the bull is killed at the end of the bullfight in Spain. And Netanyahu said, you're wrong. And for the last 10 years, Netanyahu has been the prime minister over 10 years of economic growth, 10 years of improving international relations between Israel and countries around the world, 10 years of relative security. Now, I still think, and I think everyone here in this room thinks, that the occupation needs to be ended and the conflict needs to be resolved and there needs to be a Palestinian state, because that's the just and moral solution. And also because in the long term, Israel's security needs that as well. But for the last 10 years, Netanyahu has broken the Israeli left's narrative, because you can't say to Israelis anymore, if you don't solve the occupation, you won't have a good standard of living, because Israel last year, just for the first time, got a AA credit rating from Standard & Poor's. The first time in Israeli history this has happened under Netanyahu government. So many good things, or seemingly good things, are happening to Israel under Netanyahu government, and without solving the conflict. So the left wing, and the Labour as the main left-wing party, hasn't come up with a new narrative, hasn't come up with a new raison d'etre to try and say why we. Now, I voted Labour because I'm a Haaretz lefty, and I thought that Labour still needs to be given a chance. But I can totally see why Israelis don't feel that Labour has a solution and has anything to offer them, and I can see why they think Netanyahu is much more successful. And at the end of the day, people voting for Benny Gantz, who was seen as an alternative, were voting for Benny Gantz without knowing what his plans are, because Gantz was too afraid of Netanyahu to even present an alternative plan. So he hasn't come up with a plan either. So Labour's failed. Gantz hasn't even tried. That's why the Israeli left is so weak, because they aren't saying anything which is of a new message to Israelis. Sorry to be so depressing.
Yeah, so now we've got one more question, and Liam's going to find a cheerful question. Yeah. You choose, Liam. Yeah.
Hello. So
once again, I'm hearing it from here. So whoever's
Yeah.
asking a question,
Can you stand up?
Hello.
that's okay.
there
I
you
can
are.
see. Thank you.
Yep.
hi. Okay, so ever since the recent election, myself and a lot of my friends have been feeling a little bit hopeless about Israel and seen it as a bit of a turning point. So I want to know, maybe it's just a bit of an echo chamber that I exist in, but if you think Bibi's re-election again threatens support for Israel from young diaspora Jewry.
It does. It's depressing, and it threatens support for young diaspora Jewry. I can't say that those sentiments are 100% true, and the parts of Israel where I live and socialize feel very similar. I think if you look at the numbers, you'll see that actually the right wing has not even grown. They even went down numerically from 67 to 65 seats. So things haven't gone worse in this election. But it's been perpetuated, and that's not a good thing. But I think that it just means that we're not doing our jobs as liberal Israelis and as liberal Jews and as Jewish young Jews in the diaspora who care about Israel and who feel passionate about these issues of tikkun olam and of the vision of bringing together universal humanistic ideals together with Jewish ideals. We just have to up our game, because Bibi's doing a great game. He's playing a blinder, and we have to be every bit as good as he is and his people are in doing this. So yes, it's depressing, and it's maddening that the centre left in Israel ran such a crap campaign, and looking at it in real time, I was so angry. But anger is not a solution. If you care about Israel, then this is the time to be even more energized about finding the ways to do this thing and then to engage. And I think that to me, the thing which really always keeps me optimistic is that, let's remember, 90% of Israelis were either born or the children of people who were not born in democratic countries. American and British and Australian and Canadian Jews did not come to Israel in sufficient numbers to bring their democratic ethos. So 90% of Israelis came from countries which were either Eastern Europe or North Africa or Asia, not countries where there ever was democracy. And it still is more democratic, I think, than we could hope for it to be. I mean, we have the highest expectations of Israel. We want Israel to be a beacon to the nations. We want Israel to be the best democracy in the world. But Israel's in the Middle East, and the people who live there came from either the Middle East or from Russia or Poland or Hungary or Romania. They didn't come from bastions of... They didn't come from London or Washington or Sydney. They came from Moscow, they came from Tunis, they came from Morocco. They came from countries which never had a democratic tradition. And despite all that, Israel still has a vibrant and free press. It still has an independent legal system. The democratic system works in the sense that whoever can vote, votes, and governments do change and have changed over the last 71 years. That's probably better than we could have expected. I expect much better, and I aspire to much better. I know everyone in this room aspires to much better, but we have to work hard for it. And by being here tonight, I think you're all working hard for it. So thank you so much for coming.